City reports just over 10,000 COVID cases, the lowest daily tally since late February. Calls for public housing estate buildings repurposed for isolation to revert to original purpose. And chief executive defends the low usage of facilities despite pandemic still being serious. Good evening and welcome. Hong Kong has seen the lowest daily COVID tally since late February. Around 10,400 new coronavirus infections were reported. Only 4 were imported.
And for the first time in 3 weeks, the daily death toll dipped below 200. Jackie Lin with more.
More than half of the 10,405 new cases are self-diagnoses from rapid antigen tests. The rest are detected through the traditional PCR nucleic acid tests. With that, the overall case count from the 5th wave of outbreaks is approaching the 1.1 million mark. Also, there are 192 newly reported COVID fatalities, including 30 backlog cases. That marks the first time the daily death toll fell below 200 since March the 4th. Among the younger fatalities was a 21-year-old unvaccinated man who was a long-stay patient at Siu Lam Hospital. He had hydrocephalus, the condition with an abnormal buildup of water in the brain. Having tested positive early March, the patient's condition continued to deteriorate and he passed away on Thursday. So far, more than 95% of the deaths since late December involve seniors above the age of 60. Meanwhile, authorities spot-checked 12,000 self-declared COVID cases via rapid test kits. Around 170 people tested negative for COVID in those random checks. Authorities flagged 1 case, which is suspected of deliberately providing false information. It was referred to the police for investigations. Still, the rest of the people involved in the cases will be sent to quarantine at Penny's Bay despite having tested COVID negative.
Among the cases, a very small proportion of the sampled patients, they have a negative PCR. Many we tested negative on the second day after they have received a positive RAT test. For these cases, we will carry out investigations, including collecting more information from them, including their symptoms, the reason for their RAT test, and also their contact history with other known cases, and the brand of the rapid antigen test used, and also we will arrange them to be isolated.
Authorities said the people involved would be released from quarantine after testing negative in the second PCR screening at the isolation facility. Jackie Lin, TVB News.
Lawmakers are urging the government to revert housing estates that had been turned into isolation facilities to their original purpose. Wong Yet House and Wong Ching House of Queens Hill Estate in Fanling have a total of 2,600 housing units. Some 1,200 households were originally scheduled to move into these 2 housing blocks, but they have been designated as isolation facilities. Those affected were given a one-off $8,000 subsidy from the government's Antiepidemic fund. But as more new community isolation facilities were built, some lawmakers, including Lau Kwok Fan, said it's no longer necessary to use public housing estates as isolation centers. Instead, affected residents should be allowed to move into the housing estates.
Well, meanwhile, Hong Kong's repurposed community centers, which were supposed to take in elderly COVID patients with mild symptoms, are being found to be severely underused. On average, the 6 community facilities are using only about 30% of their capacity. The recently opened Kai Tak Holding Center reported a mere 2% occupancy rate. The elderly care home industry says some 98% of care homes in Hong Kong reported outbreaks. One operator describes how their residents were discharged from hospital and sent back to the care homes when they're still COVID positive. The lapses of proper care have worsened some patients' conditions and eventually led to their death, she says. While they criticize the holding centers have come too late, they want the government to better utilize the facilities for convalescent care for recovering elderly patients. Well, in her daily pandemic press conference, the chief executive faced questions over the low occupancy rate at the city's quarantine facilities. It is believed some 40% of the newly built quarantine beds remain unused.
But Lam said if isolation facilities are full, that means the government is not doing a good job in fighting the pandemic. Sharon Tang tells us more.
Currently, some 20,000 quarantine beds have already been built with mainland support. Over the past week, the city reported about 100,000 COVID infections, yet some of the isolation beds are still empty. The chief executive today denied authorities have failed to effectively allocate patients to quarantine facilities.
We have also achieved the goal of more beds than occupants. If all facilities have an occupancy rate as high as 90% or even full capacity, that means that we are doing a poor job.
Earlier, some members of the elderly care sector suggested under urgent circumstances, for the well-being of patients, doctors can decide for care home residents without cognitive abilities if they should be jabbed. Carrie Lam said this is not under consideration.
Even when doctors have assessed the elderly and deemed suitable, they cannot be vaccinated because the family members object. This is the reality that we are observing, and it is very perplexing for us. I don't have any further notice regarding legal measures.
Meanwhile, 11 international airlines, including FedEx and United Airlines, reportedly wrote a joint letter asking the government to drop its existing pre-flight and on-arrival testing requirements for aircrew members. They say the measure caused flight delays and put their employees at higher risk of being sent to quarantine. Lam said the Transport and Housing Bureau will follow up on the matter. She insisted the SCR will not give up its strategy in preventing the import of COVID cases, otherwise it would jeopardize its chances to resume travels with the mainland and the rest of the world. Sharon Tang, TVB News.
More than 2 years after the start of the pandemic, Hong Kong's government will soon be handing out anti-epidemic service bags.
Starting next month, everyone will receive the bags, which include masks, rapid antigen test kits, and traditional Chinese medicine. Kelly Blooming reports.
Aside from the first batch of another round of consumption vouchers, the public can expect more goodies in April the earliest. That's because the government will be issuing anti-epidemic service bags to every household in the city. Each package will contain 20 rapid test kits, 20 KN95 masks, 2 boxes of Chinese patent medicine, as well as an anti-epidemic information pamphlet and a greeting card from the SAR government. The packages will be distributed through various channels.
Housing Authority will be handing out the packages to tenants in Housing Authority estates. For private buildings, we will be working with the Owners Incorporated organizations, property management companies to distribute these materials. And third, we will be relying on the civil servants and volunteers to distribute material to the 3-nil buildings, household by household.
As for households in remote areas, the packages will be handed out by Heung Yi Kok and rural committees. The government will also be setting up various distribution points across the city for people who do not receive the package to pick up. Chief Executive Carrie Lam stressed that the public did not need to register to receive the package.
It's our token of appreciation. It's also resources from the central government. So we won't be applying strict registration. That's not the approach.
Lam urged the public to get tested more often so that infections can be picked up promptly. Caleb Leung, TVB News.
Coming up after the break, President Xi Jinping holds phone call with South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol. U.S. President Joe Biden and allies unite to deal with Russia over its invasion of Ukraine.
Welcome back to TVB News. President Xi Jinping held a phone conversation with South Korean President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol this afternoon.
The conversation came a day after North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile test. According to Yonhap news agency, the conversation lasted for 25 minutes. Yoon reportedly asked Xi for close coordination in relation to North Korea's complete denuclearization and the stable management of the political situation on the Korean peninsula. According to state media CCTV, Xi said the two countries should bolster mutual political trust. On the front lines tonight, Ukraine's cities remain under relentless Russian fire.
As entire cities are flattened, more lives are shattered as the war stretches into a second month. No city has seen more devastation in this war than the southern port of Mariupol. Video posted to social media shows there's virtually nothing left. The city, encircled by Russian troops, has endured weeks of bombardment and now street-by-street fighting as the body count climbs higher. As people desperate to leave crowd near evacuation sites, others are determined to stay behind. We have surgeons, we don't have anesthesiologists. Surgeries are tough, says this doctor who's been living in a hospital for 3 weeks. More shelling in the city of Kharkiv with residential neighborhoods hard hit. All of a sudden, the ceiling fell on me, says 76-year-old Viktor Nikitiev, whose house was leveled. 25 kilometers northwest of Ukraine's capital, the town of Bucha has come under heavy bombardment. As a Ukrainian army unit prepares defenses, soldiers keep watch, anti-tank weapons and machine guns at the ready. A Ukrainian commander says Russia is still trying to resume offensives to capture several cities. In the capital, a determined president recorded a short address to his people. Volodymyr Zelensky quipped that Russia would not have gone into Ukraine had it known what was waiting for it. In the city of Odessa, normally bustling streets are empty, now protected by barricades. Soldiers and residents are on alert, waiting for a Russian offensive against the city known as the Pearl of the Black Sea. But amid the uncertainty, many residents have resolved to stay and defend the city against a possible attack.
I feel very bad because everything what happens now is absolutely terrible.
Well, U.S. President Joe Biden and Western allies pledged new sanctions and humanitarian aid in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Biden also said the U.S. would welcome up to 100,000 refugees. Alan Buckner reports.
Western leaders met in a trio of emergency summits in back-to-back-to-back meetings of NATO, the Group of 7 industrialized nations, and the 27-member European Council. They discussed the next steps in countering Russia's month-old invasion. Biden said his top priority in going to Europe was to make sure the Western response stays on the same page.
Unity, unity. And the very thing that Putin has tried to do from the beginning, and I've been saying this since my days as Vice President of the United States, is to break up NATO. Break up NATO. He'd rather face 30 independent countries than 30 united countries with the United States.
Our unity is rock solid, and we are very, very pleased to coordinate, to cooperate with you. These are difficult times, challenging times.
At a separate press conference, Biden announced the U.S. would welcome up to 100,000 refugees and be providing an additional $1 billion in humanitarian aid. He also announced sweeping new sanctions on Russian members of the Duma, the Russian parliament, and other entities.
More than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine.
Meanwhile, Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo announced a new partnership between the U.S. and European Union to reduce the EU's reliance on Russian energy. The United States and other nations will increase exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe, and EU leaders would work together on the joint purchase of LNG, gas, and hydrogen ahead of next winter. Alan Buckner, TVB News.
NATO's Secretary General said the organization is standing by its commitment to supply Ukraine with weapons and other aid. But in an interview with NBC News, Jens Stoltenberg says NATO's core responsibility is to protect its allied states.
I'd like to get your response to President Zelensky's remarks today. He said NATO has yet to demonstrate its ability to save people. Do you think that was an appropriate, a fair remark?
I think all NATO allies listened very carefully to President Zelensky, and we admire his courage and political strength in the way he stands up against the invading Russian forces. NATO allies are providing significant support to Ukraine and their armed forces with advanced air defense systems, with anti-tank weapons and ammunition, fuel, and many other types of support.
Not the things he's been asking for in terms of a no-fly zone, in terms of tanks, in terms of fighter aircraft.
Again, we are providing a lot of different types of weapons.
The idea of a peacekeeping force has been rejected by this body for fear of igniting a war between NATO and Russia. And this is a difficult question for me to ask, but is there a point in which war becomes necessary, that it's worth to take the risk because of the level of the atrocities?
NATO has one core responsibility, and that is to protect and defend 1 billion people living in 30 allied countries. We do that by sending a very clear message to Moscow that an attack on one ally will trigger a response from the whole alliance. But of course, our responsibility is to then both support Ukraine, but at the same time prevent an escalation of this conflict to become a full-fledged war between NATO and Russia.
You and President Biden have expressed concern about the use of chemical weapons by the Russians. Do you rule out a military response if there is a use of chemical weapons?
As President Biden has stated several times, any use of chemical weapons will have severe consequences. It is absolutely unacceptable. It will be a blatant violation of international law, and it will have severe consequences.
Almost 3/4 of the United Nations General Assembly demanded aid access and civilian protection in Ukraine, and they criticized Russia for creating a dire humanitarian situation. The resolution, which was drafted by Ukraine and allies, received 140 votes in favor and 5 votes against, while 38 countries, including China, abstained.
Today, once again, the world stood united. It stood united in the face of President Putin's unjustified and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Together, a strong majority of UN member states made clear that Russia bears sole responsibility for the grave humanitarian crisis and violence in Ukraine.
It is the second time the 193-member General Assembly has overwhelmingly isolated Russia over what Moscow calls a special military operation that it says aims to destroy Ukraine's military infrastructure. Russia's UN ambassador described the adopted resolution as a one-sided view of the situation.
China has called on the U.S. to stop spreading rumors aimed at smearing China over the Ukraine issue, calling the act disgraceful. The comments were made by Wu Qian, spokesperson for China's Ministry of Defense. He said Washington's recent claims that China had prior knowledge about or tacitly supported Russia's military operation in Ukraine are false. Wu said China hopes all parties will continue to be committed to dialogue and negotiations. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a great weekend.
Good night.